Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the first Grassroots Advocacy webinar being hosted by the Cancer Policy Institute at the Cancer Support Community. My name is Rob Goldsmith, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here at the Cancer Support Community. We're so happy that you can join us today for the first of what will be a series of webinars on grassroots advocacy. If there's one thing that we hope that you can take away from this webinar today, it's that anyone can be an advocate, including you. We hope to provide you with the materials and resources for you to advocate for improved quality cancer care. We also hope that you will utilize these resources. We believe that these resources will take you on a journey from being a beginner to an expert advocate. You might compare these webinars to a series of courses or classes you may have took in high school or college. Again, this is the first in a series of webinars that we'll be hosting, and so look for additional webinars that we'll be announcing in the coming months. So for those that are not familiar with our organization, this slide gives a brief overview of the Cancer Support Community. CSC is an international patient advocacy nonprofit dedicated to providing support, education, and hope to those affected by cancer. Our organization includes over 170 locations across the country. These locations and affiliates provide direct services, including social and emotional support services available free of charge to millions of Americans around the country impacted by cancer. We also have an extensive research arm with our Research and Training Institute in Philadelphia. Finally, there is our advocacy work that is being done through the Cancer Policy Institute. This includes our Grassroots network and the webinar that you all are participating in today. So this slide is a brief biography that covers my background. I'm not going to read this word for word, but I was pleased to join the Cancer Support Community in February as the February of this year as the Policy and Advocacy Director. In my previous role, I served on the staff of former Congressman Bruce Braley, most recently as a senior legislative assistant for him. So all participants, everyone on the call today is invited to ask questions at any point during the presentation. If you have a question, please type your question in the Q&A field at the bottom right of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll try to get to as many questions and answer as many questions as we can. It's now my privilege to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Zina Cary. Zina has more than 2 decades of experience impacting public policy and leading advocacy efforts at the federal, state, and local levels. Zina has held various positions, including with the International Myeloma Foundation, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and the National Health Council. She also served as a legislative analyst for a New York State Assemblyman. So Zina, without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and it is an honor to be here with you all this evening and to kind of walk through this presentation. To get us started, I'm just going to go through the presentation overview, the agenda for tonight. I think we're doing a kind of a middle dive into each of these topics tonight. So to kick us off, I'm going to start off by talking about what is advocacy, go through the many layers of what is advocacy. Talk about why it's important to share your story. I think sharing your story is something that is woven throughout any of the activities we do around advocacy efforts. The policy-making process and how that impacts our ability to change policies that don't work for patients. How do you develop a plan to, once you've identified a problem, how do you make the change? So how do you come about developing a plan? How do you identify the problem and the solution in the first place? what are the advocacy activities that we need to engage in to really push and advance the change that we want to see made? How can media help in this effort? Media is a huge portion of the work we do in advocacy, and it plays a really kind of central role in a lot of what we do in advancing issues. And then we're going to have two slides on resources that folks can use for follow-up on their own. And then how do you take action, in addition to all of the other components that we've talked about. So what is advocacy? I think that many of us have been involved in advocacy for a while, or you may be new to it. You hear the word advocacy and activism, and in my mind, I instantly think of, rallies and, different issues that are on the TV every night. But Webster defines it as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal, or doctrine or practice that emphasizes direct, vigorous action. Advocacy is, it can range from being a professional advocate to, being one that's very active in the community. We have the next slide. It's types of advocacy. You have community advocacy, which is really, community organizing, pulling together groups locally to help push the change that you'd like to see. Healthcare advocacy, focused on making changes within the healthcare system that help patients and folks, who need to take access, take advantage of that. Things like expanding Medicare and Medicaid services for people. Political advocacy, that's more your traditional type of advocacy, legislative, regulatory, which we'll get into tonight, but talking about ways that we can make change within the political system. Research advocacy, how can the facts and figures, how can we use those in our work to advance the issues? And then there's self-advocacy, which I think every one of us has probably at some point had to act in our own best interest and be a self-advocate, whether it was, navigating an insurance claim with your insurance company or working with, your doctor to hammer out your patient care plan. But self-advocacy is an important component in anything that we do in terms of changing issues. Who becomes an advocate? I think, sometimes there's a veil that comes down where people may be intimidated by the political process, and often advocacy, the term advocacy is equated with politics, but anybody can be an advocate because we're all advocates. There's really no special training required to be an advocate. The smallest of actions, surprisingly, can make big changes. It takes a lot of passion and dedication. And then I think one really key component to being a strong, productive advocate is to learn your issue, become an expert in that issue. But anyone can be an advocate. So when do we decide it's time to become an advocate? There are many, I think, kind of things that spark folks to go into advocacy, and, it can start with, are you a newly diagnosed or at another stage of cancer? Do you have a family member with cancer? Are you a caretaker? Is it a loved one with cancer or some other debilitating disease? Are you a provider or a social worker who wants to help their patients? But there's several triggers that spark folks to become an advocate. Sharing your story. I can't stress enough how sharing your story, it matters in everything that we do when it comes to advocacy. It helps to educate policymakers and others about your disease and the problem and the solution. It puts a face on the issue, which I think is really, really critical. I think, oftentimes when you go in and you do, whether it's doing a meeting in a legislator's office or talking with, a reporter about your issue, or just, having a conversation with, someone that you've just met to talk, that you're explaining it, telling your story can make all the difference in the world and really change the tide, whether it's for the big stuff where you change policy around a service that you need, or it's just changing hearts and minds, kind of perceptions about certain things. But telling your story is a really powerful component of advocacy. So how do you share your story? We're going to, as we go through tonight's slides, we'll talk about, where the story comes in, and the story comes in pretty much at every step of the way. But I think there's some few key components that folks should always keep in mind as they're sharing their story. Number one, make it personal. Don't talk jargon. It's important for you to talk about, if you have cancer, to be able to talk eloquently about your disease, but I think the most powerful piece is being able to be personal and just talk about how it impacts you. What's the personal impact? Describe how it's impacted your family as well as yourself. Again, that's getting back to the personal, but I think really laying out, how has this impacted me? How is that a part of my story? You always want to be clear and concise about what the change is that's needed to, the thing that needs to change, whether it's the policy, what's the policy that needs to be changed. Be clear, concise, and just stick to the facts. And then this last slide is my favorite, one of my favorites, because when I first started doing this work many years ago, one of the first things someone that I respected said to me was, things change when an issue is urgent, local, and scary. And I think anyone who's either had cancer or, been close to someone that has had cancer, there's nothing more urgent, local, and scary. So always incorporate that sense of urgency into your story when you're telling it, regardless of what the venue is. How do you find patient stories? I think, we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to get into how to develop a plan in a little bit. But if you are on the side of things where you are, you're running an effort to try and change, pass a bill or, in your state legislature or in Congress, again, finding the patient stories is really going to be an important element of that effort. So how do you get started? Sometimes that can be overwhelming, but I think it's important to sit down and kind of do a landscape. This piece on tips for finding patients gives, I think, a pretty good overview of where to start. I think the first thing is to get your message down. How do you want to talk to patients? What's the issue? How can you simply explain what the issue is? And get so that you can get them involved and engaged in what you're doing. And then where can you, within your own organization, look for patient stories in your patient services departments, fundraisers, ask individual doctors and medical professionals that you work with. Do you have support groups where you can go and talk to them about the issue and see if there's anyone in that group that's had, an issue where, a policy change would impact them in a positive way. But I think, really kind of digging in and finding the patient stories, it's an important part in finding those, it's important. It's not always an easy skill, but it's an important thing to do. Moving on to kind of the meat and potatoes, the policy-making process. And this, I think, can be often the most kind of intimidating to people. But our goal here is to start kind of demystifying that for folks, pulling down the curtain and exposing the man behind the curtain. And so we're going to start here with just what are the three branches of government. This slide is this model is reflected at the state and federal levels. So there's three branches of government at both the state and federal level. You have your legislative branch, you have your executive branch, and you have your judicial branch. Now the duties at the state level for the executive are slightly different than they are at the federal level, what they are for the president. But the model itself is true for both the state and federal levels. So what are the general powers for the three branches of government, state and federal? Well, on the legislative side, they're the ones, and that includes for Congress, it's your United States House of Representatives, and then you have your U.S. Senate. At the state level, you have the two chambers, but sometimes, depending on what state you live in, it can be the Assembly, the lower house is the Assembly, or the House of Representatives, and then you always have your Senate. And so the legislative branch on both the state and federal levels, they make the laws, they appropriate funds, for programs. They approve treaties and executive, although that's just on the federal side. They make appointments for the different agencies, and they establish the court system, whether it's on the state and the federal side. For the executive branch, they're the ones that enforce the law. The president enforces the law. The governor of your state enforces the law. At the federal level, they act as commander-in-chief of the military. The president negotiates treaties, and they appoint judges. Both federal and state executives appoint the judges and other top officials. On the judicial side, at both the state and federal level, their job is to interpret the laws. They review the lower court decisions. They judge whether laws and executive actions are constitutional, and they rule on cases between states at the federal level. I think a great example, we've seen a lot of judicial oversight in the last few years at the federal level, where we've had several Supreme Court cases that have come down that have, particularly on the Affordable Care Act, highly anticipated. But we've really seen where the judicial system has played a role in policy changes, much more, I think, in recently than we have in the past. But there's been some powerful examples of that in the last few years. Kind of getting down a little more into the weeds on the legislative side of things. I think the little cartoon there, we all can remember that from when we were growing up. And this process that is laid out in this slide is, it's generic. It varies from state to state, but kind of it's true. This process is. This one is really based on the federal side of things, but you start with. You find if you've got your issue identified, you want to go out and you find your bill sponsor, or often we call them our bill champion. And the bill is introduced, and then that bill is referred to the relevant committee. The bill can be introduced by a member of either chamber, whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate. Sent to committee, where it's just depending on how much advocacy is happening on the outside and how committed your bill sponsor is. The committee action, that really determines how quickly things will happen in committee. But there's just a general process that's followed in the committee. So your bill will get referred to the main committee, and then it's sent to a subcommittee for review. There's a markup of the bill, and then there's a report that's released, and then the vote goes to full committee for a vote, yes or no. Then there's the publication of the written report. Then it goes to the floor in the chamber that it started in, and there's a debate and a vote. And if it passes, it's referred over to the other chamber, where it starts the process all over again. And if it comes out of that process and it looks different than the bill that was passed in the other chamber, it has to go to conference committee. Comes out of conference committee. Then it's a final action for the president. So I'm going to stop there because I think, Rob, I'd like to give you a
Zina,
chance to jump in.
I was just going to add a point here. Folks looking at this slide right now are probably a little bit maybe overwhelmed by all of the different pieces here, the different components, because there quite frankly is a lot of things that go on in the legislative process, and the legislative process can be very confusing. And the cartoon that we have here is a great example, because I think we all remember that cartoon from grade school, and how it's a perfect example of it simplifies how the legislative process works. And I think this is a good opportunity to just give a little bit of a teaser that we're going to be delving into the federal legislative process and the state legislative process in future webinars. So we really hope to kind of dive in more detail and talk more about how the legislative process works, and really just make it easier for folks to understand.
That's right. Thank you, Rob. That's exactly right. And it can be overwhelming. I had another diagram that I was considering putting in, but I chose not to. But this is how you see how bills are passed, and there's one that shows how bills are really passed. And so the process, it's more like a meat. I always call it like a sausage-making factory. But as Rob mentioned, we'll get into more of that kind of sausage-making process in future webinars. Moving on to the next slide. there are two ways that you can approach issues from kind of in the process, not really. There's the regulatory and the legislative processes, and both the regulatory process exists at the state level as well as the federal level, just as the legislative process does. I won't get too deep into this slide or the next one, but this is just to give you kind of a sense of the steps that happen with the regulatory process. This particular slide is based on the federal regulatory process. The state process is similar, but I think the function of the regulatory process is pretty kind of mirror each other at the federal and state levels. In terms of what they do, and sometimes it's it's sometimes easier if you want to make a policy change to do it through the regulatory process than it is to do it through the legislative process, depending on what's happening in your state legislature. But it's just another way to change a policy that needs changing. Again, we will get into more details in future webinars. This next slide is it's kind of it's the same information in the last slide, just a little clearer, kind of lays out what the regulatory process is. I'm going to stop here. I think and give folks a chance. Would we like to do Q&A here?
I think we just want to remind folks at this point that if they have any questions, if any of you all have questions as Zina is going through the presentation, feel free to type your question in the box on the bottom right of your screen. And we're gonna compile the questions, and we're gonna get to them at the end of Zina's presentation.
Okay, great. So what's next? We've kind of run through the initial things to think about. What's the process? How do I become an advocate? Do I share my story? And what's the process that I'm going to be dealing with? So what's next? Well, I think what's next is we have to start thinking about developing a plan. And so this next section will kind of get us start moving in that direction. Where do you start? First, you have to start with how do you have to identify the problem. And the problem, at least in our community, usually comes from whether you're having like a problem getting your insurance company to cover the cost of your routine care in your clinical trial, or some other service that you need for your treatment. That's the problem. And so, the next thing you want to do is let me research this issue and see if there's already an existing solution to this, and if there's not, then let me do some research and figure out what is the best solution and come up with the background and the facts and figures to back up that claim. And then what's the next best step to make the change? How do I make the policy change once I've identified the problem and researched it and then determined what the solution is? What do you need to do next? Well, you've identified the problem and solution, so we want to think about pulling together a small group of folks that may have the same issue happening. To come up with a plan of action. If you've got a community of folks that are struggling with the same issue, that's often a great place to start in terms of getting people all moving in the same direction. To come up with a plan, how do I get a bill introduced? What's all of these steps. So this slide tells you kind of in very bite-sized morsels how to do that. The next slide is a sample meeting agenda. So you've pulled together your small group of people. What do you talk about when you first sit down to meet? Well, you'd want to talk about the issue that you've all come together to collaborate on, and you've come up with a solution. Have a discussion around that. What resources do you have? What resources do you need? Then you should have a conversation. Well, what's the best way to make this change? Do we want to try to get a bill introduced, or do we want to try to go through the regulatory path, or is there some other way that we could solve this problem? That's part of that discussion. Once you've laid that out, you figure out what are you up against. And then you go forward with there. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this slide, but this meeting agenda gives you, I think, a good snapshot of what you would want to discuss at that first kind of meeting of the meeting of the minds, as I sometimes call it, or your coalition or your partnership. Here's just a few more kind of brass tacks tips on how to organize your planning meeting, things to think about. I don't think these steps are no different than any other meeting that you would hold. It's just kind of, making sure if the meeting is set up and run right, it's going to make your outcome of your meeting itself, it's going to get you off to a good start in terms of, executing your plan. So what are some activities that you can build into your plan? You've decided that you want to get a bill introduced, and, what are some things that you can do to try and advance your issue within the legislature, or we'll just use the legislature as an example. Advocacy activities and tactics, emails, letters, you can make phone calls, you do tell your stories, patient stories, district visits, town hall meetings, issue forums, public testimony, organize a lobby day, and build partnerships or coalitions. You can do any and all of these things throughout the course of an issue effort, an effort to pass, to make change on your issue. So we'll start with kind of what are easy but powerful way, can be a powerful tool, and that's the email. Many of you, I'm sure, have taken advantage of, sent action alerts, which, you do through a system, but oftentimes on the other end it comes out as an email. That's one way that you can communicate by email with policymakers. Another way is just directly, and that usually happens once you've gotten into, you've gotten into an effort to pass a bill, and you're working closely with offices. So this is just an example of an email with a staff person here in New York around an issue that we were working on this year. But email, and it can be a really powerful tool, a good communication tool in your effort. Writing letters, I think, it's kind of when you think about, I know when I was a little girl, I wrote my first letter on an environmental issue, and I remember thinking, wow, this is such an amazing thing to do, and it really can be. It's a powerful thing, and, I think just taking the time to sit down and write a handwritten note to your legislator about an issue that you care about, I think that can really make a big difference. Rob, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Zina. Just one point here to make. There's a common misconception out there that writing letters to your member of Congress, making a phone call to your representative's office doesn't do anything, doesn't help, that they don't listen to it, that they just don't care. That conception is totally false. I can tell you from firsthand experience working on Capitol Hill, working for a member of Congress, that members of Congress and their staff are constantly tallying and looking at constituent letters, looking at monitoring all the phone calls. When there's an important vote on on a piece of legislation that's coming up onto the House floor to be voted on, my boss always wanted to know where his constituents were at. He wanted to know how many phone calls have we gotten in favor of this bill, how many phone calls have we gotten in opposition to this bill, have there been any letters written from my constituents about this bill. So the point I wanted to make here is that making phone calls, sending emails, writing letters, that stuff really, really makes a difference. And for folks that are at home, this is a perfect way to advocate on issues important to you without leaving your house and making a difference without walking out your front door. And I think that I would really, really encourage folks as we're kind of moving forward here with these webinars to be thinking about ways to issues where they want to contact their representatives.
Thanks, and that's exactly right. I think that's a very good point, Rob. Postcards. send a postcard. Now, when I say, send a postcard, I don't mean, send one from Vegas. There's a whole tactic within, like, an effort to pass a bill where you'll do a postcard campaign. And, with postcards, it's fun. There's a lot of different things that come out of doing a postcard campaign. But it also can be a really effective tool in terms of communicating with the folks that are going to, that have the power to vote yes or no on your issue. So this is just a sample of a postcard that was used when I worked with the International Myeloma Foundation. They had a thing called Postcards for Parity. It was a really great campaign, and they had patients, they were constantly collecting these, and they would use them in really targeted ways with legislators. So it can be a really powerful tool. What are some tips for written communications? I mean, regardless whether it's an email or a letter, or a postcard, I think there's just some kind of standard things to think about when you're doing a written communication to your policymakers. You always want to be courteous and to the point. Make sure you include the key information. You want to put, I'm writing you because to urge your support, and then put the bill number in there. And give one or two sentences on how that bill, what that change means, and then if you have a personal kind of stake in it, be sure to say, and this bill impacts me, and then say, because it will mean I will pay thousands of dollars less every month for my chemotherapy, or whatever the personal connection is. But make sure you do, if you have that personal connection, or for my mom, if you're taking care of your mom and it means she's going to pay thousands of dollars less. Be sure to include that. But you also don't want to, you want to keep it kind of short, sweet, and concise, as short as you can. Again, make it crisp, make it, something that they go in, you tell them what your problem is, thank them, and then make sure that they know who you are, where you live. Because if you're a constituent, they're going to care about that.
So, Zina, I'm going to interrupt you here for just a second because we got a really good question from one of the participants.
Sure.
That really kind of focuses in on this area you're talking about right now. And the question is, if I have a really good idea that I think would be a great idea for a bill or a piece of legislation, and I wanted to contact my representative, do I send them a fully written proposal? How exactly do I go about as a constituent getting my bill submitted? And I think that the answer to that question is members of Congress are always looking for ideas, different ideas and thoughts from constituents about, if there's a particular area, that you think is a really great, proposal or idea. Don't feel like you have to hire a lawyer and get somebody to, write out legislative language for you. You can very easily write your idea or proposal, in a letter. It can just be a couple of sentences even. I think that we should be doing this when it comes to, good quality cancer care. And you can send that proposal in and ask, the member, would you consider introducing something, a proposal like this as a formal legislative bill?
That's excellent. That's very true, and this dynamic exists at the state level as well. So yes, I think that's a really great point. And the other thing you can do is, find out if there's a group that's already working on it. Because if they are, then you can plug into them. But if you have a fresh new idea, I agree. Take it straight to the person who can help you. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide, which is making phone calls. Again, this is just a sample script that you can use. This is just, kind of a generic, well, it's not generic, it's an issue related to cancer, but this is just to give you kind of a sense of what you would, how you would run the call. But it's no different than if you pick up the phone. Let's say you have to call your insurance company to talk about a problem with your coverage. There's just kind of a standard way to talk to a professional office, and I think you should, always abide that same kind of protocol if you're making a call to a member's office. It can be such a powerful tool. When we've used, again, like the postcard campaigns, I've used, we take a whole day and just, and this is back in the old days, but you can do it with cell phones now, where you have like a call-in day, and you decide you have your targets, and you make phone calls into a member's office, or like whether it's their office in their state capital or Washington or their district office, but you have a whole day where people are just making calls and urging that member's support of a specific piece of legislation. It can be a phone call can make, you wouldn't believe the amount of difference it can make. And I'm sure, Rob, you can speak to that too from your Washington experience. It really can make a difference.
Absolutely. I think any, phone calls are extremely important, especially when there's, a really important piece of legislation that's about to get voted on that, is probably getting a lot of media attention or media coverage. Absolutely, it makes a huge difference.
So, and in all of these activities and tactics we're talking about, being strategic, and again, just to throw out a teaser, being strategic, we will get into how are you strategic with these things? We will get into in greater detail in future webinars, but just being strategic is always important. This is just more tips for making phone calls. Okay, what's the next kind of next level thing that you can do? Oftentimes when you think about, legislative visits or meeting with lawmakers or policymakers, it's often, think lobby days, and those are really great events, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But there's also things you can do at home, so you don't have to, get on a plane or drive and fly to Washington, or get in your car and drive to your state capital city. Sometimes, the effort that you're involved in means that, the best tactic is to sit down with certain members, whether it's the state legislature or Congress, sit down with them at home in their districts. And there's a lot of advantages to doing those types of meetings, especially if they're on a recess, because, they're a little more, the offices aren't as busy. They're busy, but it's not like a session day in Washington or Albany where it's just the offices are so crazy. But so it's a little more quiet, and oftentimes you have a better chance of actually meeting with the member, whether it's your House of Representative member or your U.S. Senator or your member of the state legislature. If you meet with them in the district, you oftentimes have a better chance of actually getting face-to-face with the member through district visits, and they know right away that you're a constituent. So a district visit can be a super powerful tool to use. And again, always think, how can I do this in a strategic way? And then I also offer here some tips to think about how to conduct the meeting. And common theme, always share your story. But again, district visits can be a really powerful tool. Organize a town hall meeting. Town halls, and the next slide is about issue forums, which they're similar in nature. Town halls are a little more. A lot of times when I think town hall, I associate them with political campaigns. Where you have a candidate, holding a town hall meeting to meet with, potential voters because they want their vote come November. You can use a town hall setting for, to highlight your issue as well. And again, be strategic. Maybe you do a town hall during election season where you're talking about your issue and you invite the candidates to your event. I mean, there's just lots of fun, creative things you can do with the town hall setting. Moving on to the next slide. Coordinate an issue forum. Again, like I said, it's similar to a town hall meeting, except generally you have, with issue forums, they're a little more focused. You have a panel of folks, usually, 2 or 3 people that are, experts in different areas of the issue that you're working on. You have, a really kind of set time for like panelists to speak, and then Q&A and discussion. So it's a little less, town halls tend to be where you ask, folks have, there's more time for Q&A. So it's just a little more, it's just a little more kind of formal. An issue forum is a little more formal, but again, it can be equally powerful a tool depending on like when you decide to like hold the issue forum. And then we have a checklist that I think holds true regardless of which type of event that you're organizing, whether it's a town hall or an issue forum. There's just certain things you should follow, kind of like a checklist of things to do. That I always call it, it's like a Betty Crocker cake mix. You know, a lot of this stuff is, it's like a cake mix. You just add water and eggs, and there you go, and put the good energy into it. And so this is a good checklist to help, bake your cake for these events. Hold a lobby day. Now, some of you or many of you or all of you may have at some point participated in a lobby day, whether it was in your state capital or in Washington. Lobby days are really fun and exciting, and I think they serve they serve lots of purposes. One, it's bringing a lot of people together for one day to really kind of spread out and, hit as many offices as you can to try and talk about your issue and try to get some movement on your issue. It can also be a real energizer for your organization or the group of people that you're working with, because you're coming together for one day. Everybody's there for the same reason. You're having success in your meetings. It just creates this energy and kind of camaraderie around your issue so when you leave after that day, I've often left after lobby days and just felt going into them tired and coming out of them just so re-energized about my issue. And again, they can really help to, push your issue forward in terms of where it's at in that legislative process. So I think lobby days are well worth their salt.
Zina, I just want to interrupt you here for just a second, just to mention, and you did cover this as well, but lobby days are typically organized by large organizations.
Yes.
For example, Cancer Support Community. Cancer Support Community we've done lobby days in the past, and it's very typical that when you do a lobby day in Washington D.C. or in your state capital, it's organized by an advocacy organization like the Cancer Support Community.
That's right. Yes. Thank you, Rob. So moving on to the next slide. And so this is just a checklist for organizing a lobby day. But as Rob said, you all will probably be plugging into, something that the Cancer Support Community is doing. But this is just a good checklist so you can kind of see how these things come alive. It's a lot of work, but it's worth the hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into it. What's another activity that folks can do? Now, this, give public testimony, and this is really a part of the legislative process. Often your bill gets introduced, it gets referred to a committee, and then what will happen is, as part of that committee process, generally speaking, the committee will have a hearing on sometimes, depending on the state, it's different at the state level than it is at the federal level, but, in some states they'll have a hearing on one bill. But at some point, if you get your issue moving, there'll be a public hearing, and folks will be allowed to come in and give public testimony. It's and what you're doing is you're testifying in front of the committee that is, charged with deciding whether or not your bill gets to move on to the next process. So being able to sit down and give a 3 to 5 minute testimony on why that bill is important to you can be a really powerful thing, and be really effective in terms of advancing your issue. And this is just a snapshot of some public testimony that I've given in the past.
So, and Zina, let me just add again to, this is another example where I think folks might have the perception that, I'll never, when would my member of Congress invite me to come and testify at a committee? That's crazy talk. They would never invite me to Washington D.C. to testify. But we in the office that I worked in, for the congressman that I worked in, at least I'd say on average, we were inviting constituents to come out to Washington to testify, maybe 5 to 10 times a year, if not more sometimes. I mean, it is a very, very common thing for constituents from various districts that are experts in their areas, experts, for example, in quality cancer care, to come out to D.C. and testify in front of a committee. It's a very common thing.
And to build on that, at the state level, it's a very common thing too. I'm been involved for years now in a lot of state campaigns and on a range of issues. And so anytime a bill comes up for a hearing in a state, it's always we need a professional advocate to testify, and we need patient stories. And I think the patient story side of the testifying, it's really huge when it comes to giving these public testimonies. So it's that's to Rob's point. I mean, it's something that's done at the state level. It's really important as well. And then the next slide is just giving you some tips if you find yourself in a situation where you've been asked to give public testimony. These are just some tips for how to put it together. But there'll be other tools, I'm sure, available to you on all of these subjects going forward. So, building partnerships. Why is this important? I mean, there's strength in numbers, right? So, my experience in dealing with tough issues, and let's face it, a lot of the issues that we try to tackle in the cancer world are tough. And so it's really important to have friends and to have a community of folks that you're working with. We usually call them, whether it's a collaborative partnership or coalitions, typically called coalitions. But again, putting together the right group of people or stakeholders to come together and work on an issue is really a powerful thing in advancing an issue. And so this just gives you a few tips on what kind of goes into putting together that initial group. And that initial group should and will probably be part of like any sort of planning session, to develop a plan from the start. But I think putting together a coalition is kind of a fundamental, or a partnership group is kind of a fundamental piece of any effort to try and change a policy. Rob, did you want to add anything to that as well? Sure.
Nothing really to add at the moment. I think you did a pretty good job covering it. I guess one quick thing, we are gonna we'll continue to build upon this this tool, building partnerships, in the future webinars as well.
Right. Okay. Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, media. When I first started doing this work a little over 22 years ago, I worked with someone who was and still is like a media guru. And, he essentially, pounded into my head that, what's the point of doing it if you don't get media for it? So, and I've learned that, and media doesn't have to be like, you're like a news story about you on TV. Media can be lots of different things. And so when I say media, there's lots of tools you can use. There's the letter to the editor. There's the opinion editorial. There's the more kind of high-level news conferences. There's the radio and TV interviews. There's the profile stories. And then there's like the new wave of media, really the social media, Twitter and Facebook and then there's Instagram. I think Twitter and Facebook are typically the two platforms, social media platforms that people are using, and that includes members of Congress, their staff, state legislators and their staff, and other policymakers. So all of these tools can be, using these tactics can be really, really effective. So we'll start with the sample letter to the editor. This is just a sample letter to the editor that we used on a Cancer Treatment Fairness Act a few years ago. It's a template that we give folks that, ask them to submit letters to the editor. When you're drafting, these are some tips on how to draft a letter to the editor. Letters to the editor it's kind of like the phone call or the letter to legislators that we were describing before. It can actually be really powerful, especially if you get your timing right when you submit your letter to the editor. But these are just some tips and things to think about when you're writing your letter to the editor. The next is an edit. Rob, did you?
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. I guess one point I'd like to kind of emphasize here as you're going through these examples of different ways to utilize media. I really, truly believe that the media can be one of the most important tools and one of your most important allies when it comes to advocacy. Hands down, when there is a local news story about regarding some issue or some piece of legislation or some bill, and it gets mentioned on the news story that, oh, Congressman so-and-so or Congresswoman so-and-so isn't a supporter of this bill or doesn't co-sponsor this bill.
Right.
You can guarantee that member is going to be like, oh, we need to get on this. You know, it grabs their attention, and they, you know, when it gets on TV and when it gets into the news, they're definitely going to be quick to notice and quick to take some action on it.
I couldn't agree more, and I'll just give a quick little story, and then we'll move on. But it's so true, because I've had many issues over the years where we thought our bill was dead in the water 6 weeks before the end of session, didn't have a patient story in sight, and all of a sudden this amazing patient story pops up, and we were able to get it in the New York Times. This was here in New York, but get all the big papers to cover it just at the right moment, and use that to in 6 weeks later we had the bill passed, and it was on its way to the governor's desk. So the media can make or break your issue. And again, it's there's all these really powerful tools that you can use, and it comes down to timing and strategically knowing when to use which tool. So this is the opinion editorial, which is slightly different than a letter to the editor, and they both appear on the editorial page of a newspaper. But this is just an example of an opinion editorial that we got placed moons ago on a cancer-related issue. And so, you can do opinion editorials and letters to the editor from different perspectives. You can have a patient writing these pieces, which is a different perspective than having, a healthcare provider write a piece. But they can complement each other. And in your effort, your campaign or whatever you choose to call it, you can have that discussion about, having a certain patient write a piece and this is all like a more kind of in the weeds stuff. But these are all really can be really powerful tools to pushing the issue. These are some tips to draft opinion editorials. Again, it's just kind of straightforward, kind of standard rules that I think every newspaper follows. Sample news release, which goes with you usually use a news release there's two pieces that go with it, a news advisor, but then a news release is something you use if you would use a news release if you did a town hall meeting. You would use a news release to go with your issue form. You use a news release for your news conference if you decide to do a news conference. Whatever the media tactic is, if it's an event, you're usually going to use a news release. And one of the biggest advantages of doing a news release is that a lot of times, and I have a lot of reporter friends, and I wouldn't feel they're really smart, but a lot of them are lazy. And so, if you write, I mean that in a good way, sometimes because they're busy, they're super busy, and sometimes if you give them a news release that's well written and not too long, I've seen my news release show up as a story in a newspaper, and so I think a well-written, really concise news release, that you've put out after around an event, you can write the story for them, and you can't ask for anything better in terms of controlling how your issue is portrayed in the newspaper. So the news release is a really powerful tool. Tips to organize a news conference. A news conference is no different than, it's essentially, we just did a news conference in May here in Albany, and it was around a bill that we're working on a different issue, not outside of the cancer world, but it was, it's kind of your setup where we had the two bill sponsors there, the legislators, we had representatives from patient organizations. We had two patient stories, and we gathered there's a press room in Albany where we gathered and reporters came and we talked about our issue, and, we made the point that we wanted to see our bills move out of the relevant committees in both the Assembly and the Senate. And so that event was great because it was one kind of it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You get all these, all the advocates and all the patient stories and the right legislators and invite the reporters in, and you just talk about the issue. And we got a lot of it's a really good, easy way. Not easy, it's a lot of work, but it's a good way to get good kind of a blanket coverage with a lot of different papers and radio stations and TV stations in one day on your issue. giving radio and TV interviews. Now, these are more, this is like really kind of at the high level of things, and it usually happens around an event or a news conference. Let's say you do a news conference, and a radio reporter pulls you aside afterwards and says, "I'd like to interview you about this issue," or "I have a weekly show, and I'd like you to be on it." And then same with TV, TV interviews. A lot of times they're reporting for the nightly news, but then there's like the weekly show or the political show where they're, or Health Today show where they might want to talk to you about, your issue. So these are just some tips on how to give those interviews. Again, these are things that we will get into in future. We can get into more in future webinars, but really, really powerful tools in the work that you do. Social media. And I have to admit that, I like social media, and I've just only in the last couple of years started to use it more in a professional manner. But, Cancer Support Community is ahead of the curve on this because I subscribe to your your Facebook page and your Twitter page, and I'm really impressed with all the great, and it's constant stuff coming out. And I'm seeing more and more policymakers in Washington and at the state level starting to pay attention to these conversations that are happening on Twitter and Facebook, and then participating in them as well. So these are just some snapshots of some of the great things that Cancer Support Community has generated on Facebook and Twitter. And then these are some tips for using social media, in our way, in an advocacy way. Just some things to think about when you do it. What are some additional resources? So the first slide is just, next two slides are just, so you've got a link to the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And if you go to those links, you can kind of see what's happening in both of those chambers. There's also, you'll find, if you wanted to look up a bill, there's a link there a link to Thomas that helps you look up the bills. And you can also use their tracking system. But I think really for what I like to do is to go to those sites and just, you can see what's happening that day, on the floor of the House of Representatives, on the floor of the Senate. And it's kind of fun, to see what they're up to outside of what you're seeing on the news. The next link is to the National Conference of State Legislatures. It's a really great organization in Washington, D.C. that tracks all 50 state legislatures as well as the issues that are, working their way through them. They also are kind of a barometer for what are the hot issues happening in state legislatures. It's a really great group, and it's a good way if you want to just kind of see what's happening generally out in the states. It's a good site to go to. And then, of course, there's the Cancer Support Community, which has a fantastic website with, chock full of information on cancer services available, and so much more. And you should definitely use that as a resource on the work that you do. Additional kind of federal websites that I think are very helpful. You've got the National Cancer Institute, which is just chock full of statistics on cancer, what's happening with clinical trials, with the progress in clinical trials. It's just anything having to do with cancer. The NCI website is a great place to go. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That's where Medicare and Medicaid, the Medicare and Medicaid programs are housed. So anything having to do with those two programs, you can find out about at CMS. And then, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and that's where, anything with the drug approval process, the FDA oversees all of that. Again, these two slides are just meant to give you kind of key resources to go to if you have a question about certain things. And then, of course, you always have Rob Goldsmith and the really great folks at Cancer Support Community to help you as well and act as a gigantic resource for you.
And let me, Zina, thanks, and let me use just this opportunity to encourage people, if you could go back to that previous slide.
Yes.
To go to visit cscadvocate.org and to join our Grassroots network. If you haven't done that already, we urge you to sign up. We send out monthly email updates. anytime that, folks here at CSC are going up to the Hill to have meetings, we're sending updates and about the work that we're doing here in Washington. So highly encourage folks to sign up. If you go to cscadvocate.org and click the Join Now button, which is in the upper right-hand corner.
And so I will advance to the last slide for Q&A. And I think this brings us to the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Zina. We really appreciate your presentation. We thought it was very informative. And again, this is just a reminder to folks that if you have a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A field in the bottom right of your screen, and we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can right now. And actually, the first question that we got a really good question from a participant that's wondering, what is the difference between legislative policy and regulatory policy? Because they were kind of confused about what are the main differences between those two things. And I think maybe a good example here that we could use that folks on the phone might be familiar with is clinical trials, which are done at the National Institutes of Health. And clinical trials, that is an example. The protocol that is put in place, the rules that are put in place for clinical trials, that's regulatory policy. That is something that policy that is developed at the National Institutes of Health. Congress does not write legislation to specifically go in and look at clinical trial protocol. It's the National Institutes of Health that does that. So there are these, there are certain areas where Congress will write a proposal, it'll get passed by Congress and signed into law, and they'll have a policy, but then they'll say, well, for this specific thing, let's just have the executive branch take care of it. Let's just have, this agency like the National Institutes of Health or the Food and Drug Administration. This is more up their alley. This is, we need to have the experts over at FDA or NIH working on this in more detail. I think that's a good way to kind of sum up the differences between regulatory and legislative. I mean, do you have any comments on that, Zina? Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add to that is that, because then you get into, like with clinical trials is a great example. Several years ago, I ran a bunch of campaigns in the states around an insurance coverage for routine patient care of clinical trials, because that was an access issue for patients. So I think and how do we attack that? We attack that through the legislative process. So I think that's a great example of something that is clearly, like, in terms of the protocol and how clinical trials operate, it's clearly a regulatory issue. So, and a federal one at that.
So another question that we got, Zina, and I'm going to let you take this one. It's a really good question from a participant who wants to know how would they be able to affect change if the patient that they're trying to help lives in another state. So they, for example, live in Oregon and the state of Oregon, and the patient that is the cancer patient lives in Arizona. So how would they go about, advocating for that patient if that patient lives in another state? Should they contact their legislators in Oregon, or should they contact the legislators in Arizona? What would be the best course of action?
I guess it would depend on what the issue is, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
What would be the issue? Is it a federal issue? Is it a state issue? I mean, what is the issue that the person is having?
Yeah.
Or if are they having problems with their insurance? Are they having problems with their insurance plan? I mean, if that's true, then that would be, something that would be specific to their state, because every state has their insurance departments that oversee the insurance policies for that particular state. And so I guess it would really just depend on what the issue is that the person's having. Right. And then once you kind of do like a profile of what the issue is, and then you can determine how they best move forward.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I would say that, like, for an example, like if it was a state law that was affecting someone that you were trying to change. Like for example, maybe it's a friend that lives in another state that you're trying to change a state law. Then in that case, you would need to contact the state legislators for the patient that's living in the other state. You wouldn't want to contact your legislators.
Absolutely. And you may want to also think about plugging them into a group in their state that may be working on the issue.
Sure. Yeah.
So they could get plugged in that way. So yes.
Yeah. Another question we have here. How many people do I need to gather in order to make an impact or change policy?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think, one person, can make a huge difference. But like I said, when we were talking about building partnerships, there's always strengths in numbers. So I tend to start small, create kind of your kitchen cat, your brain trust, if you will. Start with 3 or 4 people and that have, like-minded people, folks who are struggling with the same issue, and, do that first powwow and have a conversation about, what's the problem, what do we think is the best solution, and then kind of map out what your plan is going forward. What's the best way to tackle it? And again, we've given a few tools in this presentation to help you with that, but there'll be more tools coming down the road to do that. But I think start with 3 or 4 people and go from there.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think that really when you're starting from the beginning, it really only takes one person in the beginning, and it's that one person that leads the effort. Yes, you'll gather more people behind your cause as you go, but really at the end of the day, like, it's that one person that gets things started, which was why all of you on the phone, all as individuals, all have the opportunity to make equal amount of impact. It really starts with one person, in my mind. Great. So another question that we have here, Zina, kind of a curveball question, I guess. How should children and young people be engaged in advocacy?
Oh, you know what? I think children and young people should be engaged in advocacy from the start. I mean, you look at, there's so many great groups in Washington that have, affiliates in the states that, do work around childhood cancer issues. And you go to there's nothing more powerful than going to a lobby day with a room full of children. And when I worked for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, because so many of the blood cancers impact children in a disproportionate way, we often had children plugged in not just to lobby days, but doing letter writing campaigns in their schools. There's just all the tactics that we kind of laid out here today. You can get kids involved in, and I think it does 2 things. I think 1, it's an amazing kind of asset to a campaign, and 2, you're teaching that kid about the democratic process from a very early age, and that's kind of the good government person in me, but I think getting kids involved is I think it's awesome. I think it's a really great thing to do.
Yeah, great. So another question here, Zina, that I'm going to take go ahead and just answer, and maybe you can add your thoughts. One of the participants is wondering if we can walk through how the funding process works, how funding is distributed from D.C., to the different agencies and to each region or state for cancer issues and support. And, the best way to answer that is Congress has the power of the purse. And ultimately, Congress is the initial decider on where funding is going. And they're the ones that are deciding, if we're going to allocate this much money to this agency, we might allocate, recently you had the 21st Century Cures bill that was recently considered, which is a bill that would boost funding by, I believe, $10 million to the National Institutes of Health. And so really it all starts at Congress. And then once the money is appropriated from Congress to the different agencies, the agencies will then, decide, they have the money allocated to, there's certain divisions and what have you, and they then decide how to best utilize that money and the resources. I don't know, Zina, if you have any other thoughts on that?
Oh, the only thing I would add to that, I think, is that there's a whole separate funding process at the state level, because states have their own state budgets with their own set of state agencies, including like your insurance department, and your health departments, which typically, like on the issues that we all care about, those two agencies are usually the ones that that we'd have the most interaction with. And so, but things like when I worked in the Assembly, I spearheaded an effort to get funding through the state budget in New York to set up a mobile mammography van, especially so in rural areas, like in New York. That was a huge thing. It was a big thing for folks that live in big rural areas. So that's that was a state funding issue, but there's a whole separate funding process at the state level that can help patients as well.
Great. Well, thank you again, Zina, and thanks so much, everyone, for your participation today and all the really great questions. Most importantly, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this first in our series of webinars, Bristol Myers Squibb. So thanks again to everyone, and please keep an eye out for an announcement on the next upcoming webinar, which we'll be holding in the coming months. And don't forget to sign up to be an advocate at cscadvocate.org. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you.